Who are you? And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we're here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time to talk about military history, military doctrine, and the practices of great military leaders, and then distill from them lessons that we can apply to our business and professional lives in order to make them more successful. So, excuse me one second. Okay, I have my little space heater on here because it's a little bit chilly this morning. So today I'm going to talk about the greatest sailor in English history, Admiral Horatio Nelson, and the topic of the show is navigating chaos. And that's really why Nelson was such a great naval leader. And as I do for these shows, I'm going to give you some information about his biography and the kinds of and about the battles that he fought, and then we'll talk about what we can learn from that. So, jumping right in, there's so much to say about Horatio Nelson. So first of all, he was born on September 29th, 1758 in Burnham Thorpe, in Norfolk, which is in the eastern part of England. He died, pardon me, on October 21st, 1805, at age 47 off of Cape Trafalgar in Spain. He actually died in battle, and I'll talk about that in a little while. So he was born in a modest but respectable family. He was the sixth of 11 children. His father was Reverend Edmund Nelson, and his mother was Catherine Suckling. His naval career, as was common at the time, began when he was 12 years old. Okay, he joined the Royal Navy as a midshipman in 1771 through the patronage of his uncle, his mother's brother, Maurice Suckling, who was a senior officer in the Navy. So it may sound strange to our ears, a 12-year-old becoming a midshipman and joining the Navy, but in a family as large, especially in a family as large as Nelson's, where 11 children, and he was the sixth. So even if his father had any kind of estate, Nelson was very far away from any hope of inheriting any money from his father. And so, as was often the case for younger sons during this time period, they considered careers that included the Army, the Navy, and the clergy. And then they also looked at potentially becoming gosh, I'm going up in the word, but apprentices. So he might have, clerked for a lawyer with the idea of becoming a lawyer or a barrister, or he might have looked to potentially go into medicine. So Nelson quickly distinguished himself for his bravery and leadership. And by 1779, he had risen to the rank of captain. Okay, so 8 years. In 8 years, he made captain. Now, by comparison, today in the U.S. Navy, generally speaking, you enter as an ensign. 2 years later, you're unless you do something incredibly boneheaded, you become a lieutenant junior grade. 2 years after that, for a total of 4 years, you become a lieutenant. And then it's probably going to be at least 3 to 4 years for you to gain your next promotion to lieutenant commander. Okay, and then probably another 4 years at least to become a full commander. So generally speaking, it's going to be somewhere around 15, 16 years in order to become a captain in the United States Navy. At least, by the way, at least could be longer depending on what corps you're in. So Nelson made captain in 8 years. Now, that wasn't unheard of in the Royal Navy at that time, but it was pretty quick, even by the standards of the day. And he served in the West Indies, he served in the Mediterranean and in the Baltic, and he had a reputation for being very aggressive tactically as well as being strategically brilliant. So I'm going to talk about 4 of his battles, of his key battles, that give you an idea of his quality as a naval leader. So in the first is the Battle of Cape St. Vincent, which took place on February 14th, 1797. So he had been a captain at that point for about 18 years. And this was during the French Revolutionary Wars. Okay, the French Revolution, of course, started not long after the American Revolution. And the Battle of Cape St. Vincent was between the British Royal Navy and the Spanish Navy off the coast of Portugal, near Cape St. Vincent, which is, of course, where it got its name. The British commander was Admiral Sir John Jervis, okay, and Nelson served under him. The Spanish commander was Admiral José de Córdoba y Ramos. Okay, the British fleet contained 15 ships of the line. Okay, so a ship of the line is bigger than a frigate. Okay, a frigate is a 3-masted ship. Generally speaking, it has, I believe, one deck of guns. So a ship of the line was typically either 2 or 3 decks. You did have like 6th rates, which may have only 1 deck, but these were very large ships for their day. They would be the equivalent of, battleships in World War II. I guess they'd be kind of the equivalent of cruisers today. We don't really have ship of the line type ships. Aircraft carriers aren't really a ship of the line because they're not primarily gun platforms. They're primarily aircraft platforms. Okay, the Spanish fleet had 27 ships of the line in it, so almost double the number of British ships. And the outcome of the Battle of Cape St. Vincent was a decisive British victory. So although the British were vastly outnumbered, Jervis and Horatio Nelson used superior tactics to win. And the battle badly weakened the Spanish Navy and prevented it from joining forces with the French fleet. And it really solidified Nelson's reputation, in part because he pretty boldly disobeyed orders and engaged aggressively with the Spanish fleet. So there was at the time I believe it was called the Naval Chronicles, and whenever there was a noteworthy happening in the Royal Navy, so it would be written up in the Naval Chronicles, and this is how other people in the Navy, as well as the public at large, learned about victories or disasters that had occurred with the Royal Navy. So this battle would have been written up in the Naval Chronicles, and that's really what led to the tremendous fame that Horatio Nelson gained during his career. So among the notable moments in the battle was Nelson took the ship HMS Captain. HMS stands for His Majesty's ship. HMS Captain out of the battle line and engaged with the enemy directly, and he captured 2 Spanish ships, the San Nicolas and the San Josef. And again, this was, to take a ship out of the battle line. That's not how things were done. And yet, Nelson, he was a smart enough tactician to realize that the rules should never be broken except for when they should be broken, right? And that's one of the reasons why he was able to be so successful in this battle. And again, the aftermath of this battle was Britain gained naval supremacy in the Mediterranean. Number one, Nelson became a national hero, and Spain remained, although Spain remained Britain's enemy, it was significantly weakened at sea as a result of the Battle of Cape St. Vincent. So the next notable battle took place about a year later, a little over a year later. It was the Battle of the Nile, also known as the Battle of Aboukir Bay. And it was a major naval action fought between the British Royal Navy and the French Navy from August 1st through 3rd in 1798 in Aboukir Bay in Egypt. So it was one of Horatio Nelson's greatest victories, and it really secured British dominance at sea, while at the same time disrupting Napoleon Bonaparte's ambitions in the Middle East. And if you ever have read the Horatio Hornblower novels, which written by C.S. Forester, wonderful historic fiction set against the Royal Navy. So there are several references to Nelson's victory at the Nile, and in fact, the eponymous character, Horatio Hornblower, I believe he was in one of the ships, or obviously this is fiction, but he supposedly was in one of the ships in Nelson's fleet at the Nile as I think a midshipman or something like that. So, oops, I just blasted my notes. Okay, so all right. So the British commander was by this time, Nelson was a rear admiral. So it was Rear Admiral Horatio Nelson. The French commander was Vice Admiral Francois Paul Brie d'Egalier. Hopefully I said that correctly. The British fleet was 14 ships of the line. The French fleet was 13 ships of the line and 4 frigates and transport ships. So again, the French fleet was, in this case, a little bit bigger. The French were known to be better sailors than the Spanish at this time period. Okay, and again, the outcome was a decisive British victory. Excuse me. So, Napoleon had invaded Egypt in an attempt to weaken Britain's influence in India. India was essentially a British colony. And his fleet had transported 38,000 troops, but they had to anchor in Aboukir Bay for support. And so and by the way, 38,000 may not sound like a lot, but that's a huge army by the standards of the day. So there's no doubt this was a very strong force that Napoleon was sending or intending to send into Egypt. Okay, and Nelson, in the meantime, was looking for the French fleet, and he finally found them, in Abacour Bay on August 1st of 1798. So the French were anchored in a defensive line near the shore. They were expecting an attack from the seaward side, and Nelson's fleet boldly sailed into Abacour Bay, between the shore and the French line, and in so doing, he was able to attack them from both sides. Surprising the French fleet, who thought they were only going to have to defend themselves from the seaward side. So, among the notable things that happened in the battle is that Nelson destroyed the French flagship, L'Orient. And his ships just overwhelmed the French center, which is where L'Orient was. And at 10 p.m. on August, I believe it was August 2nd, L'Orient exploded, killing Admiral Bruet, and really just devastating French morale. And the battle continued on, but by August 3rd, most of the French ships were destroyed or captured. And indeed, only 2 French ships of the line and 2 frigates escaped. So 11 ships of the line were either captured or destroyed, as well as 2 frigates were either captured or destroyed. So it was, a wipeout for the French Navy. So why it's important? Well, Napoleon was stranded in Egypt now. His navy could no longer supply or resupply him or reinforce him. Britain gained complete control of the Mediterranean from east to west, isolating France. And again, he was proclaimed a national hero for this tremendous victory. The relations between England and France at this time were horrible. The English despised Napoleon Bonaparte. He was a tyrant. He was a blackguard. Every horrible thing you could think of was said about Bonaparte, it was even to the point where when parents would discipline their children, they would say, if you're not a good child, Boney's going to come and get you, which was a derisive nickname for Napoleon Bonaparte, Boney. As a result of the victory, Nelson earned the title of Baron Nelson of the Nile. Pardon me. And it was really a turning point in the war against France. Okay, the next battle, let's talk about this one just real briefly, the Battle of Copenhagen in 1801. So again, Nelson ignored orders this time to withdraw. Instead, he pressed forward, and he secured a crucial British victory against this time the Danish fleet. So you notice he defeated the Spanish, he defeated the French, he defeated the Danish fleet. Okay, his best known battle, and perhaps the most, but certainly one of the most significant naval battles in history, is the Battle of Trafalgar. It was fought on October 21st, 1805, off of the southwestern coast of Spain, near Cape Trafalgar, again, hence its name. And again, it was a decisive British victory against the combined fleets of France and Spain. And it was during the Napoleonic Wars. And the result of this battle was to secure British naval dominance for over a century. And indeed, that naval dominance didn't start to wane really until World War I. And then, of course, post-World War II, the United States became the dominant naval power in the world. But for a century after the Battle of Trafalgar, really the British Navy ruled the seas. There's no question. So the British commander was now Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson. The French commander was Vice Admiral Pierre Charles Villeneuve, and the Spanish commander was Admiral Federico Gravina. The British fleet had 27 ships of the line. The French and Spanish fleet a total of 33 ships of the line. So again, the British were outnumbered, although not nearly as outnumbered as in the Battle of Cape St. Vincent. So Napoleon was planning to invade Britain, which of course was one of the great fears of the British. But not unlike Hitler in World War II, Napoleon had to gain control of the seas first in order to launch an invasion of Britain and be able to resupply and reinforce that invasion. So the French and Spanish fleets joined forces to challenge British naval supremacy, and Nelson, commanding the British fleet, intercepted them off Cape Trafalgar before they could reach the English Channel. So and Nelson used an unconventional strategy. So the typical strategy, for example, used by Admiral Jervis at Cape St. Vincent, was to use a single battle line of ships. That was how battles were fought at this time. Nelson divided his fleet into two columns, and instead of attacking the ships perpendicularly where you could launch broadsides at each other, he attacked, instead of sailing parallel lines to each other where you could blast broadsides at each other, Nelson sailed perpendicularly to the French and Spanish fleets, thereby being able to launch broadsides at the enemy ships without sustaining them himself. So ships, wooden sailing ships like this, they would have what were called bow chasers, which were small guns in the bow of the ship pointed forward, but they weren't nearly as large and powerful as the main guns. The main guns could be 24-pounders or maybe even 16-pounders on the upper decks. The bow chasers might only be 9-pounders. Okay, and the pounds being the size of the shot that was fired. So by crossing the T, as it was called, Nelson was using an unconventional strategy, but in doing so, he was able to cut the enemy fleet in half and prevent them from being able to maneuver effectively. And so he really had the combined French and Spanish fleet at his mercy. So the fighting began at 12 p.m., that is noon, on October 21st, 1805. HMS Victory, which was Nelson's flagship, a ship, by the way, that you can still visit today in England. It is, I believe it was recently refurbished, recently in the last year or two. The ship is kept as a museum now. He led the attack, and he sailed straight into the Franco-Spanish line. There was heavy fighting with ships engaged at very close range. At around 1:15 p.m., a little over an hour into the battle, Nelson was shot by a French sniper from the Redoubtable while standing on HMS Victory's deck. He was carried below, but he lived long enough to hear of Britain's victory in the battle. And his last words were, "Thank God I have done my duty." Needless to say, to utter such a humble statement as he was dying cemented Nelson as Great Britain's greatest naval hero. No one has ever surpassed him. By 5 p.m., 22 French and Spanish ships had been destroyed or captured. The British lost no ships despite being outnumbered. It shows you the brilliance not only of Nelson's strategic plan, but the tactical execution, not just by Nelson, but by his subordinate commanders who all aspired to live up to the standard that Nelson set. So why is the Battle of Trafalgar important? Well, first of all, it ended any hope that Napoleon was going to be able to invade Britain. Again, it confirmed British naval supremacy over the next century, and it catapulted Nelson to essentially eternal status as the legendary naval hero. And because of the crippling of the French and Spanish navies, Britain was not only the greatest naval power for a century, but they also really gained control of global trade routes, which gave Britain access to tremendous sources of wealth, and indeed. Britain became during the 19th century and the reign primarily of Queen Victoria. Britain was, the world power. There's no denying it. So, in his personal life, I just want to talk a little bit about his personal life, so you get an idea of who Nelson was. So, Nelson was known to be extremely charismatic personally. He was adored by men. He was loved by women. He was married to Frances Nisbet, but he had a notorious affair with Lady Emma Hamilton, with whom he had a daughter, and it is really one of the best known, most famous love affairs, of all time. So you could say, well, that's not a nice thing for Nelson to do. Maybe his personal life perhaps didn't quite match his professional life. Unfortunately, that's too often the case. He went, after his death at Trafalgar, he was brought back to England. He was buried with full honors at St. Paul's Cathedral in London, where his tomb remains to this day as a national monument. And one of the aspects of Nelson that was so astonishing was at a time where there was a huge separation, not just class-wise, but just sort of everyday wise, between naval officers and rank and file sailors. Nelson had fairly close relationships with the average sailors with whom he dealt with in the Royal Navy. And this was very different than his contemporaries. So it really it mirrored more how the American Navy handled things than how the British Navy traditionally handled things. So among the aspects of this kind of peculiar feature of Nelson as a naval leadership was he really he was approachable, and he had a very personable leadership style that promoted camaraderie and morale among rank and file sailors. He took a genuine interest in the well-being of his men. He made an effort to understand their hardships, and to be a sailor on a wooden sailing ship in the 19th century was a tough life. You ate salt beef, salt pork, what was sometimes known as salt horse, because a lot of times you couldn't be exactly sure what the meat was. You ate hardtack, which was a kind of biscuit, but it was hard, like so hard you oftentimes couldn't bite it with your teeth. You had to soak it in water to get it soft enough to be able to eat. The hardtack, after a while at sea, would develop weevils, and you would tap it on the deck or the table in order to get the weevils to scramble out before you ate it. Drinking water was in casks in the hold of the ship, and although at the beginning of the voyage it might be relatively decent, later on in a voyage there would be awful green stuff, slime in it, and so the food was awful. Hammocks were slung 18 inches apart, below decks, so you had no personal space at all. The way you went to the bathroom is you went what was called the head. It was basically at the bow of the ship. It was set up with a wooden board that you sat on and did your business. That's why on naval ships today the bathrooms are called the head. And so the life of the average seaman was pretty bleak. Nelson did his best to understand those hardships, and because of his attitude, he engendered tremendous loyalty from the average sailors, and his men called him with affection "Our Nelson," right? And you wouldn't have heard them addressing other naval leaders in that way. So Nelson fought alongside his men, enduring the same kinds of dangers and hardships that they faced. He was wounded a number of times. He lost the sight in one eye at the siege of Calvi in 1794. He lost his right arm at the Battle of Santa Cruz de Tenerife in 1797. And despite these injuries, he commanded with a tremendous amount of energy, again, earning a deep respect by rank and file sailors. Really, he led by example, an important leadership quality. He believed in fair treatment and being generous in rewarding bravery and competence. So he praised his sailors in official reports, and made sure they received the prize money that they were due from ships that were captured. Okay, at a time when official reports often only highlighted the captain's actions and were designed to make the captain of the ship look as good as possible to the admiralty. Again, this was a very unusual trait on Nelson's part, to make sure that those who deserved credit received the credit in official reports. And he really, at a time when discipline on a ship was being whipped with a cat of nine tails. Okay, a cat of nine tails was basically a handle covered in leather that had 9 leather straps emanating from it with knots in them. Okay, and the bosun's mates would lay it on with a will, as was the order. Nelson really he did not engage in unnecessary and harsh punishment, which was very common in the Royal Navy at the time. There were many commanders who would order floggings for the slightest infraction. Nelson did not do that. And again, his fair treatment, his rewarding of valor, his refraining from unnecessarily harsh punishments, all gained him the loyalty of rank and file sailors as well as his junior officers. So Nelson, there was something called the Nelson touch, and it was sort of it was like he had an intuition about how to fight a battle, and because of that, especially his subordinate officers had a great deal of trust in Nelson, and that trust, I think, oftentimes made the difference between them, following him because they had to, as opposed to enthusiastically following him. And enthusiasm in a battle can turn the tide, even when a plan maybe isn't as well thought out as it could have been. So, Nelson believed in empowering his officers and sailors to use their initiative in battle rather than waiting for orders. Again, this was a trait much more common at the time, especially in the American Navy. Nelson was small d Democrat in some ways. I don't know that if he would. I don't know if he would agree with that assessment, but he wanted all the members of his crew, all the ships in his fleets, to look for opportunities to attain victory, and so his sailors and junior officers knew they had his trust, and they knew that he delegated the authority to them so that they could act in the best way possible. Finally, he had an emotional connection with his crew. So, unlike many Royal Navy officers who were aristocrats, they came from the landed gentry, etc., from the aristocracy in Great Britain. As I mentioned in the beginning, although Nelson came from a respectable family, he wasn't landed gentry or anything like that, and so Nelson saw himself as part of a naval family rather than above the rank and file in the Navy, and his sailors and junior officers recognized that attitude on his part, and he the even in the Battle of Trafalgar, as he lay dying, and his last words, as I mentioned, were, "Thank God I have done my duty." They were followed immediately by "God bless you, Hardy," and it was directed to his close friend, the captain of the flagship, Thomas Hardy, and it showed that even in death, Nelson, reached out to his fellow sailors, and acknowledged them, and it was just, most Royal Navy leaders just did not have that kind of deep emotional connection, be it with their senior commanders, if we're talking about an admiral like Horatio Nelson, or their junior officers. If again, referring back to the Horatio Hornblower series, so one of the traits of Horatio Hornblower is he keeps himself separate on purpose from his junior officers and men. He purposely does not have that kind of emotional connection with him because he thinks that it makes him look weak, etc. So, and that was a fairly common attitude in the Royal Navy. So, Horatio Nelson was a very different kind of officer, and I think that's largely why he again, and through to this day, lives on as the greatest member of the Royal Navy has ever had. So, Nelson's bond with his sailors, even after his death, he was honored by them as a national hero. He was what's the word I'm looking for? um, gosh, I'm going up on it, but after somebody dies, mourned. He was mourned by sailors that had served with him. They brought him up in conversations, and in many ways, Nelson lived on long after his death because of the way the sailors who had served with him kept his memory alive. Um, and his leadership style really became a model for future naval commanders. So from Nelson's career, I've talked about some of these things during his history, but I've distilled 7 lessons that I want to share with you. So um, uh, first of all, Nelson started at a very young age. As I mentioned, he joined the Royal Navy at the age of 12. He got hands-on experience in naval operations from a young age. He was mentored by Captain William Locker, who taught him the importance of initiative and bold action in naval warfare. And he served in a lot of different places in the world. So he learned diverse naval strategies and how to command under different conditions, all in the early part of his career. So this is, well, if you're, an old guy like me, this isn't quite so relevant, but if you're younger and starting out, you can see that getting diverse experience in the early part of your career will turn out to be very valuable as you work through your business and professional life, and finding mentors who will commit to helping you develop as a businessman or as a professional. Again, there is no substitute for that. In these days of virtual meetings and such, it is one of the things that I think is not good about that is we don't have the direct human contact that really, in an informal way, helps younger people find strong mentors with whom they can bond, and by whom they can be served throughout their careers. And it's a shame because, as Nelson's career shows us, having mentorship and consistent mentorship from a young age really, helps someone develop very strong skills, tactical, operational, strategic. Okay, second is, and I've mentioned this in several of the battles. Nelson developed unorthodox thinking and aggressive tactics. So, unlike most of the naval officers of his day, who followed rigid naval tactics that had been used for decades, if not centuries, right? Nelson favored bold and decisive actions that surprised the enemy, and in doing so, gave him both a tactical and a strategic advantage in gaining victory. So he rejected the conventional line of battle formation, where, again, you had these ships sailing in parallel lines, oftentimes in opposite directions, banging broadsides at each other, sort of a mutually assured, destruction, if you will. And he developed more flexible strategies. He prioritized speed and maneuverability, and the idea of breaking the enemy's battle line to create chaos, which then created opportunity for his ships to engage in ship on ship actions or capture enemy ships. So, we talked today about thinking out of the box. So this is what I will say is, Nelson surely was schooled in the conventional strategies of the day. However, he didn't let himself get hemmed in by them. And that's the lesson that I think we all need to learn. And that is, first of all, we have to know what the conventional strategies are. right? Until we know what they are, we're not going to know which unorthodox strategies are and tactics are most likely to be successful. So by knowing conventional strategies of all the navies, not just the Royal Navy, uh, Nelson was able to, in some ways, predict the situation into which he was heading, and in that way develop strategies and tactics that could disrupt the conventional strategies that the enemy was using. And that's what we need to do as well, whether it's in a business or a profession. We need to understand, how do other people approach these problems, and then what can we do that's different that will disrupt them. So disruption is a very popular concept, has been for a number of years now. The problem with how disruption often is pursued is that uh, uh, disruption is pursued just for the sake of disruption, okay, rather than a thoughtful form of disruption that's based on an understanding of what the other side is doing and how it can be turned on its head to our advantage. Okay, so that unorthodox thinking and aggressive tactics, another lesson we can learn from Nelson. So I mentioned a few minutes ago the Nelson touch, the idea of a sort of revolutionary strategy, most exemplified by the strategy he used at the Battle of Trafalgar, where instead of using the conventional line of battle, he attacked at a perpendicular on a perpendicular axis, I mean, and in so doing, so surprised the other the enemy forces that they were essentially overwhelmed again. And also another part of that was attacking in two columns rather than one. So we had two columns attacking the enemy fleet. So um, there there's just no other way to describe it, and that's why it became known as the Nelson touch. And it had to do with a deep understanding of how the enemy would fight. Probably the only other military person who had such a deep understanding of the enemy is my perennial favorite, General George Patton, who spent an enormous amount of time studying both military history and doctrine of foreign militaries to really understand how they would approach a battle at any given point, right? And it was because of this that Patton had an almost uncanny insight into the enemy that allowed him to be so successful. No other commander in any of the armies in World War II had anything like the depth of historic knowledge that Patton had. There were other commanders that had other strengths, but when it came to understanding the enemy, no one understood the enemy like Patton. And I think the same is true. And Nelson exemplified that. I don't want to say that Patton learned that from Nelson. I don't think that that's the case. I don't ever recall anything in Patton's background that he studied, naval history, nearly as much as land-based warfare, or in particular, Nelson's history. He probably was aware of him at least a little bit because Nelson was instrumental in the defeat of Bonaparte. But the two men shared this quality in common. So the Nelson touch allowed him to be victorious even when he was outnumbered, and that's what we want to look for too in our businesses. We might call it punch above our weight, right? And I think we're more able to do that today than ever because of things like the internet, which can give us a worldwide reach despite being a small company, whereas 50 years ago, only companies of a very large size could afford to be selling products or services worldwide. Today, that is not the case. With the internet, we can sell virtually anywhere, no matter what the size of our business. And as well, AI is also, I think, going to give smaller companies, smaller businesses, practices, the ability to punch above their weight. These can all help us to develop our own touch, okay, like the Nelson touch. Okay, next, Nelson really learned from past battles. So in the military today, we call it hot washing, where after an evolution, we sit down and we analyze what happened, what worked, what didn't work. And that was something that Nelson did as well. So he studied his past naval engagements and analyzed them, both whether they were victories or defeats. He was a big believer that lessons could be learned from both. Okay, and he also incorporated the lessons from previous British naval commanders, such as Admiral George Rodney, who had first experimented with breaking enemy lines, right? And so he wasn't afraid to borrow from other people. He didn't have to be, 100%. Originality was not the issue. The issue was success. Okay. And I think some of us get hung up on, well, I can't use an idea unless it's my idea. There isn't a whole lot of new ways to skin a cat, as my dad used to say, if any. So the better thing to do is to look at what is being done and look for ways to develop those rather than trying to come up with something that's brand new. Okay. And then the other thing was, because he studied past battles, he studied the victories, the defeats, as well as the victory. So Nelson had the ability mid-battle to change his tactics. So as he saw how things were shaping up, he was able to respond in a cogent way, and that's important for us as well. So, each thing that we do in business, whether it's marketing a new product, whether it's hiring people, whether it's presenting a case in court, all of these are opportunities for us to learn. Okay, and we need to analyze them, and the more we're willing to do that, the better we can adjust tactics on the fly and be more successful. So I certainly see that in my practice as a professional fiduciary. There are some lawyers who clearly they're learning from previous cases. They're learning because typically there's a series of cases called by the judge. They're watching the cases called previous to theirs to see how is the judge responding today, and tailoring how they handle their matter based on where the judge is coming from on that particular day, right? And that's an important skill. We want to believe that judges are impartial and that they don't bring their personal lives into the courtroom. Not true at all. Not true at all, right? Judges have all their stuff going on, and so one has to not only understand judges in general, but individual judges and how those judges behave and handle things. Okay, so learn from past battles, learn from things that have gone before you. Next, Nelson, as I mentioned a little while ago, he trusted his subordinates and he decentralized command. So Nelson encouraged especially the captains of the ships in his fleet to think independently, which was unusual in an era of very strict naval discipline. He empowered his officers. He trusted them to make decisions, especially in the heat of battle, so that they could take advantage of a situation for the overall good of the fleet. And his approach made the British fleets more flexible, more responsive, and therefore more likely to be able to outmaneuver the enemy and win the battle. And this is the same thing in business. We have to trust our subordinates. We have to give them the opportunity to make decisions, without our input, and make mistakes, learn from those mistakes. Okay, we in the beginning we may need to help guide them a little bit and help them do their hot washes. Okay, but we need to empower our people so that they will take ownership of, or not literal ownership, but take at least part ownership in the sense of really wanting to drive the business toward meeting its goals, meeting its objectives. And Nelson, that was probably next to his ability to think out of the box, his ability to develop mutual trust with his subordinates, and therefore to decentralize his command, probably his greatest trait, and certainly his greatest leadership trait. Okay, next is courage and leading by example. So I've talked about this idea of servant leadership. If you watched the show before, you know I'm not a particular fan of it. What I am a fan of is leading by example and showing courage in leadership. If we want, and that's certainly what Nelson did, as I demonstrated through the talking about some of those battles. If we want our people, for example, to conduct activity on behalf of our business in a reputable, moral way, we need to set that example. We need to demonstrate that we are, at least at time, not at least, that we are willing to stand by our principles, even if it means potential loss to the business. That our reputation, or the reputation of the business, is more important than short-term financial gain. And I would venture to say that one of the reasons why businesses have a bad reputation is financial expediency too often is used to justify straying from the moral path, right? And so it's easier to do this in a smaller company where there's a more direct connection between the owner of a business and people who work for it. But even in a large business, even in the largest business, senior leadership can set the tone, leading by example. Finally, and I didn't really talk about this a whole lot in my explanation of Nelson's victories, but Nelson understood the importance of psychological warfare to intimidate his opponents. We already talked about morale, which might be an aspect of psychological warfare. In this case, psychological warfare what had to do with things like surprise, violating the tenets of standard naval doctrine. All of these put his enemies off balance, at least, and really it caused a pause, almost, if you will, and it necessitated his enemies having to rethink, which is something they weren't used to doing. And so that psychological warfare, that psychological aspect of warfare, was something that Nelson understood, and he used it to demoralize the enemy commanders in a way that meant that they were not fighting as effectively as they might have, and therefore he could have an advantage. So these are the and these are the kind of things that we can think of too. So I I'm not, as you know, I'm not a big fan of calling business warfare, but we need to remember the psychological side of business, and we need to use it to our advantage. So, for example, this is going back a couple of months ago. I was negotiating a situation, and the other side was pressing me to agree to certain things that um, were at complete odds with what we had discussed and agreed to before. And so I decided to just basically cut off communication. And for several days, I got frantic, ever more frantic messages from the other side. You have to do this. You have to do this. And I didn't respond. And they got more and more frantic. And I didn't respond. Okay? And when after a week and a half, I re-engaged with the other side, I actually went over the head of the person that I had been uh, negotiating with, and I basically said to his supervisor, uh, "Here's what was going on. This is not acceptable. And if you are interested in negotiating, uh, it'll have to be you and me." And frankly, it worked. Um, we had strong mutual interests, and so it was worthwhile for both of us to engage. But the forcing of the more junior person that I'd been negotiating with to get almost to a hysterical point and realize that he couldn't force a resolution on his terms really kind of pushed them back, and it showed them that the only way this negotiation was going to come to a successful conclusion was by negotiating on the merits, right? And it's a form of it's a psychological tactic, and so I think we have to be aware of those and use them when appropriate. So I think that there's perhaps one famous phrase that Nelson used that sums up so much of what Nelson was about as a figure and why he remains England's most beloved naval commander to this day. And that is before the Battle of Trafalgar, Nelson sent out a message to his fleet, and it said, "England expects that every man will do his duty." And that may sound a little bit strange to our ears at a time where doing our duty is just not something that we really focus on. But the idea of doing one's duty, of elevating oneself in that way, I think is a tremendous morale booster. And it says something about the moral tone with which we're approaching, in Nelson's case, a battle, in our case, a business situation. Each of us needs to do our duty. And if we want to be successful in a way that we can look back on and feel that we've not only been successful, but we did things the right way, I think we need to focus on what is our duty, not just to the business and to customers. What is our duty to our fellow citizens, our duty to ourselves and our families, our duty to God. All of these things are part of running a successful business in a way that enhances our reputation as business people, as businessmen, and not detract from it. And certainly Nelson exemplified that throughout his career. So that's my take on the business lessons we can learn from Admiral Horatio Nelson. I went a little bit longer than I normally do. I appreciate you hanging in there with me, especially those of you who are watching live. It's always great to see you. If you have any thoughts, questions, comments, please feel free to comment on my social media posts. The links will be in the show notes, and always happy to hear your thoughts. So tomorrow, Wednesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time, is our monthly Economic Echoes show. We're going to look at the economic data and see what that means about the decisions we need to make in our own lives, whether it's our business lives, personal lives, etc. Okay, so please join me again tomorrow, Wednesday, 10 a.m. Pacific time. And then next week, Monday at 10 a.m. Pacific time, is my show, Trust and Estates Weekly. And then 7 days from today, we'll be back for the next edition of Business Lessons from the Military. So I thank you very much for joining me, and wish you a wonderful rest of the day. Signing off as I always do. Marie, darling, you are my bell.